Hey guys, it's Donald and Michelle Wells, and we're excited to spend some time with you this evening, um, talking about self-protective vows. Say hi, Michelle.
Hi.
Hey,
I hope you guys had a great weekend.
yes, and hopefully that you're getting this right in the midst of your weekend, so you're enjoying yourself. We are excited, blessed, and humbled
Mm,
to spend time talking with you about self-protective vows, just because they are vitally important and uh, truly impacted our relationship
so
today, to this day,
today, yes,
today,
today too.
today also. So we don't have a whole lot of time, but we're going to run through it. And as always, if you have thoughts or questions or anything, you can always reach out to Kelly or us or anything like that. So I'm going to see if I can get our screen to share so that there you go. Self-protective vows, breaking free from unhealthy and healthy behavior.
All right, go for it.
All right. So self-protective vows. We're not going to read the slides to you, but one of the things that I find vital on this is that the second bullet point, vows can be made knowingly or unknowingly in response to an emotional trust of wound. And I think that's really important. And in a couple of slides, we're going to get into what some vows are.
Mhm.
But what I want you to know is that as you think about it and you look at this, the unknowing vows are probably the ones that I consider most difficult to deal with
Yeah,
because you never know when they're going to pop up.
and they do.
They
They
do.
pop up.
They do.
And another thing to remember is that usually self-protective vows come from painful experiences that we've had in the past. Could be childhood, could have been when you were a teenager, could have been a past relationship, but they are usually created from painful experiences.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And what we're going to talk about as we go through it is how these self-protective vows end up crowding out God's impact
Yeah.
on our life. So
And they can work. It's not that they're
absolutely.
not effective. They do work in protecting us, but it actually serves as a way to choose your vow and protection for yourself over God and what He has. But we'll get into all that.
We'll get into all that. We're jumping around already. We're a mess. So here's how self-protective vows are really formed. There's an experience, like Michelle said, a hurt or
Yes.
pain,
Mhm.
and then you give it meaning. And I love the give it meaning part because you start to develop your vow and you say, I'm
Mhm.
not going to let something happen to me again,
And elevate it.
and elevate it. Oh, I
Mhm.
like that. But what do you have anything here? Because I want to jump ahead so that we can show some examples of vows.
You do you. I'm ready.
All right. So I'm going to jump ahead. It's going to probably be a little jumpy here. Uh, but so I wanted to really show some examples of some self-protective vows so that we don't continue to use this term
Mm,
and somebody says, I have no idea what they're talking
mm,
about. So Michelle loves this and she teaches on it a lot. So I'm talking probably way too much, but it's when you start to say never, must,
always.
always, things of that nature. And I personally believe that it's a great opportunity for you to listen to your spouse
Yeah.
or your dating partner. Or,
Yeah. Or your fiance or whoever. But it's a great way to build intimacy, get to know them better. Did we mess up? Are
nope,
we
we're still
good?
going.
All right. Excellent. Um, and we'll talk about more about maybe some examples of our self-protective vows that we continue to work on as we get more into this.
There you go. So I'm just getting us back to where we were. So I told you it's going to be messy when I moved it around like that.
Well,
I
all
should have
right.
just moved the slide.
All right. So self-protective vows. So these are the effects that they have on you. In it's interesting because we elevate them. We give them sort of power. We give them a backstory. We do all these things, and then we start to make life decisions in accordance with the vow.
Yes.
And so that becomes our truth. Like that is like the ultimate, that everything has to be weighed and looked at through this vow or this thing that we decided is going to happen or never going to happen or things like that.
Yeah. And I think the last point there, level of intimacy becomes secondary to protection.
Mm-hmm.
And I also believe that transparency becomes secondary. And it's really hard to have a vibrant relationship without a ton of transparency in it. So I think that not only does, and I do believe that transparency enhances intimacy.
Absolutely.
So I think that that's all in play there. Uh, One of the concepts that Ron has talked about, families of origin, and I want to just use a real quick example here. And it's about a vow and how we live out of our past sometimes as we make these vows. One of the things that I had is I still have kind of a weird relationship with my family. And,
Really?
yeah, it's odd. And I would go weeks, literally weeks, without speaking to anyone when I was in middle school and high school in the house, and it was just always hard for me to find my voice in that family. So I would just withdraw. I wouldn't fight for it, and it got to the point where I'm like, you know what? I never want to be around anybody where I have to fight for my voice, and that started to limit where I would go and who I would interact with because if you didn't acknowledge me right away, I had very little use for you. So that started to create a truly a limiting impact from a self-protective vow that I made when I was probably in middle school.
So real quick before we leave this slide, just I want to make sure that we're understanding that level of intimacy becomes secondary to protection, which is what it says. But just understanding intimacy, meaning, emotional intimacy,
Absolutely.
spiritual intimacy, and then also physical intimacy.
Absolutely.
All of these things are affected by these vows.
Absolutely.
I don't want to let that go because sometimes I think people think about, oh, emotional intimacy, it's heavy, it's a lot,
Right. Yeah.
but it affects sex.
Yeah. And I mean, Michelle had a self-protective vow where she would never rely on a man. Right?
We're jumping ahead, but yes,
Yeah.
yes.
And that
Financially,
never rely on a man financially. And that impacts all of those things.
it does.
It does. I mean, you look at that and you say, there's no way that that impacts physical intimacy, but it absolutely did and does.
I'm working on it.
Yeah,
Working on
there you go.
it. Oh, all right.
All right.
So more effects.
More effects. Um, one of a couple of things that I really want you to get out of this slide as you look at it is that uh, self-protective vows limits and hinders the relationship between us and God.
Yeah.
And obviously, He sent Jesus to create a pathway to Him. And then we create self-protective vows that starts to eliminate or to make that pathway more difficult. God doesn't do anything. Jesus doesn't do anything. We do it ourselves to make that pathway uh, more difficult.
Yeah. And, so often self-protective vows are usually brought into our life by sin.
Mhm.
And it can be our sin
Mhm.
or it can be when someone sinned against us. And either way, we have control over our sin, but we don't have control over when someone sins against us.
Right.
But it does have an impact on us. So, and the thing about the self-protective vows, it has a negative effect over our core identity and who we are
Mhm.
and how we see God.
Right.
Because we're basically circumventing our belief that He is in control and He has the power to do anything
Right.
and heal anything.
Right. And I think that when we start to circumvent that relationship, um, we also, and we talked about this earlier in this class, we want to be a gift to our mate.
Mhm.
And um, in order to be that Christ-centered and that godly gift, we have to be very secure and solid in our relationship with God.
Yeah, and know that we are His. Yeah. So self-protective vows in the Bible.
You just said this. Surplants the true power of God's in our lives. Kind of.
I wouldn't have used that word. That's a
Yeah.
bigger word than
Yeah. Yeah.
but yes, it does. It's yeah, we take over power that we should be giving God and try to protect who we are in our circumstances.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I really like that surplants the true power of God in our lives. There's a lot of studies, and you can find a ton of studies, but I believe that one of the most powerful pieces of God being our lives is the relationship that uh, we should have, or we Jesus wants to have with us, the relationship that Jesus wants to have with us. And um, man, that's the true power. That's where the grace comes from. That's where the love comes from, and that's where, like, even if you've never been in a relationship that worked, or you don't know how to raise a kid because your parents didn't do it well, Jesus is always a great example for us. But we need to be in relationship with him in order to learn those lessons.
Yeah. And God sees us trying to do it ourselves.
Yeah.
And that we don't do that well.
No. No. And I think that goes into the concept of perfecting versus perfected.
Yeah.
Right.
Look at you.
I know, right?
Just throwing it out here.
Boom. I think God is pleased with us when we are perfecting. He doesn't necessarily expect us to be perfected because he created one person for that purpose.
It wasn't us.
It wasn't.
It wasn't you.
It wasn't me. It wasn't me.
Oh, that's so horrible. Okay.
No, but are you done on this slide?
Yeah. Well, go ahead.
Before we leave, Jeremiah 2:13 have dug their own cisterns, broken cisterns that cannot hold water, and I love that because if you do the study of it, the water is the living water. What's the living water? The living water again is the relationship with Jesus. So we create these cisterns, and we break them, and we commit these sins, and again, it just hinders the relationship.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I am not perfected in my relationship in any way, shape, or form with Jesus.
With Jesus?
With Jesus.
Just the one with Jesus.
Just the one with Jesus.
Okay, so let's go ahead and read this.
Okay.
We might as well read the Bible.
How about it?
Why not? So we're looking at Isaiah 30, 15 through 17, and you'll excuse me, I gotta move it a little closer. I'm old. Okay, so God, the Master, the Holy of Israel, has this solemn counsel. Your salvation requires you to turn back to me and stop your silly efforts to save yourself. Your strength will come from settling down in complete dependence on me. The very thing you've been unwilling to do. He's waiting around to be gracious to you. He's gathering strength to show mercy to you. God takes the time to do everything right. Everything. Those who wait around for him are the lucky ones. That's like a mic drop. I don't know what to say.
And I love the message when it says those who wait around for him. And the hardest thing for us to sometimes do is just sit in a situation instead of trying to fix it and trying to move it forward. God promises us our needs.
Yeah.
And sometimes we need to be refined. And sometimes refining is hurtful.
Yeah.
But God promises us our needs.
Yeah. And so self-protective vows, they tell us to withhold love and grace and forgiveness from others in hopes of keeping us safe. And truly, God's calling us the exact opposite of that.
Yeah.
And wants us to give love and grace and forgiveness, even when it's hard. And that's actually what's going to protect us.
And to take risks. I mean, yeah, right? He calls us to take risks. He calls us, so, okay, we're not necessarily totally in self-protective vows here, but he calls us to take risks. He calls us to be his light. He calls us to say, God bless you to people. He calls us to take risks in different situations.
And we're called to be Christ-like to our spouse.
Yes.
And so, that requires love and grace and forgiveness and all of those things. And we can't get away from that. That's just truth. All right. Oh, you know what? Speaking of truth,
the first truth is Jesus set us free.
Yes, he did.
And Satan hates that.
And the second truth, speaking of Satan deceives us into taking control.
That's right.
We're thinking that we can do something that can keep us safe and protected when we just can't.
And I think that this is right in the middle of the slide. Where have I sinned in response to being sinned against? I think that's really hard because Michelle has been saying it. If somebody sinned against me 20 years ago, and I have a self-protective vow that means I'm going to withhold grace, withhold love, withhold some emotional part of my being from Michelle, then that sin from 20 years ago, I'm just repeating it today against Michelle. Even though I think that, man, I'm doing the right thing, I'm truly sinning. And then, I mean, obviously it can be crazy obvious, right? I mean, somebody that was abused now is very free with their body, right? That's usually, or they're leaving. I think Julia this weekend says out getting it in.
That is JP. That's what evidently we're calling her.
Yeah. So so Julia talks. So I mean, yeah, sometimes it can be really obvious, but sometimes it's not.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's just not obvious.
Yeah. So, but it's really good inventory to look back and say, where have I sinned in response to being sinned against? And where maybe am I currently sinning in response to being sinned against, either recently or even in the past?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that the next slide is really great because self-protective vows, in those areas where we put those vows in place, and remember, I will never, I always, or whatever like that, it leads to an isolation. It absolutely leads to an isolation. And man, it's hard to have great community with self-protective vows. And I believe the community goes beyond that old theory of the 5 people you hang around with the most. If you don't listen to the church's podcast, in between, you should at least go back and grab one where Adrian Ash talked about just her doubt. I think the podcast is probably in January or so, because she gives great examples of what a community could look like. And I think that it becomes really important to make sure that we have those great communities, and that requires transparency and it requires intimacy. I'm in a men's group, and that men's group has a tremendous amount of intimacy. And I know that sounds odd for most people, but there's a tremendous amount of emotional vulnerability. You say the word for me?
Vulnerability.
Thank you. Among that group.
Absolutely. And just lots of good points on this slide, but I just want to kind of highlight that isolation offers intolerance of others, and community offers love and tolerance for others. And this is something that can be learned and taught. And, man, no place in my life do I need to learn more tolerance than I do with my spouse. And love. Anyway, okay, so.
I'm checking how far along we are. Okay, we've got like 2 or 3 more minutes.
Or so. We'll get it. We'll get it. Okay.
Ready?
Yep.
Let's go. So I love.
That's great.
Yeah, I love this. Matthew 11:29. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in the heart, and you will find rest in my soul. I really love 28, the verse before that. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Michelle knows.
Just breaking out the scripture.
I am. Michelle knows that last year I spent a year studying Matthew 11:28, to try and understand what this rest is and taking my yoke. Um, I really encourage you to spend a lot of time thinking about how you get that rest. And we're going to show you in a minute. There's a couple of slides later where we're going to show you rest.
But really good to remember that I can only rest when I don't have to protect myself.
Yes.
Because self-protection is a full-time job, and we don't have to do it. Because when we ask Jesus into our lives, that's part of what we get to say to him is, "You're up."
Yep. And JP, Julia, this weekend, it's almost impossible while living in my will versus God's will.
Absolutely.
And Julia, it's almost impossible to achieve the rest. And Julia talked about this weekend during the sermon. So if you look at this slide, one side of it is rest and one side of it is not. Which side of it is rest, Michelle?
Well, let's see. I would say that rest would be identity in Christ. Am I right?
You're right.
Oh, look at that.
There you go.
Look at that.
So these are the actions and activities that we kind of want to have.
Yeah. And the self-protective vows, they create a competing identity between ourselves and God, honestly. So we push Jesus out of the way in order to hold on to things that we have believed or thought would keep us safe.
Yes. And truly, Jesus is the only vehicle to keep us safe.
Yes. Yep.
We've already looked at this slide, but it's in here again.
Mm-hmm.
Please, please, please. I really believe this is a great opportunity to learn how to listen to each other. And then First Peter chapter 3.
What are you just showing off now?
I am. Talks about gently exploring some of these things with your spouse.
You know, good things. Ron had talked about it last week in class about how, you know, when you marry someone, you're making a covenant with them and with God, and that it allows God to speak to you through another person, and how cool that is. And so as you guys are kind of looking through and trying to figure out maybe what some of your self-protective vows are, it's always good to open that conversation up with this person that you want to be vulnerable and transparent with and say, hey, what are you seeing?
Yeah.
And so it's a really great opportunity to kind of practice those things.
And please, when you practice those things, you are not a counselor.
No.
You do not have the right answers.
No.
Your objective is not to try and fix anyone or anything.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you do, you move God out of the center of the two of you.
Absolutely. You don't want to go and say your self-protective vow is.
Mm-mm.
But again, just to walk through, I want to walk through the example. We talked about it earlier, but we'll just kind of walk through it.
Remember time.
Yeah, okay. So my self-protective vow, one of my many self-protective vows, is that I would not be financially dependent on a man. I was in a relationship, actually I was married, and it was an abusive relationship and really not good. And I couldn't get out of it easily because I was financially dependent on him. And so I said, I will never be financially dependent on a man again. And you know, God has such a sense of humor, because I can't tell you the numbers of times where I have had to come head to head with that and kind of hand it over to God and say, okay, I'm not going to say that anymore. And here I am in a position where I am financially dependent for certain periods of time, and that I've had to be okay with it. And I've had to trust God to handle it and to keep me safe in it.
So, yeah. So the next slide is activity of sharing your vows. So just an activity where you get to go through and practice some of the things that we were talking about.
And I bet it's going to be homework this week.
I bet so.
I mean, I haven't seen it yet, but my guess is it's going to be homework this week.
So we're not going to go on with a long rambling conclusion because we're probably already a little bit late.
Mm-hmm.
But man, we are blessed and excited that we get to talk with you about self-protective vows.
Mm-hmm.
Please, please, please take some time and study them, because it will come back.
Yeah. And we look forward to seeing you guys on Thursday. And if you have any questions, come with them. We would love to answer any questions you have.
Have a good one.
Thanks, guys.